George Harrison, often known as the Quiet Beatle, was far from the outspoken, dramatic figure that many associate with musical legends. He rarely lashed out, didn't seek the spotlight, and was the calmest of the Beatles. But beneath this composed exterior, George carried a quiet bitterness that deepened over time. It wasn't something he displayed outwardly, nor did he often discuss it publicly, but his sense of frustration and alienation from his bandmates, especially Paul McCartney, was real and personal. His inner conflict and sense of being overshadowed by his more dominant bandmates led to long-lasting resentment. George's journey through the Beatles was one of quiet suffering, with his spiritual pursuits and meditative calm acting as a mask for deeper unspoken pain. The beginning, a teenager's dream of music. George Harrison's story began in Liverpool, where, as a teenager, he rode the bus and met Paul McCartney. The two bonded over a shared love of music, skiffle, rock, and roll, and their friendship grew from there. George, who was a quiet, impressionable young man, admired Paul's confidence and later John Lennon's brilliance. By 1958, George joined Lennon's band, the Quarrymen, when he was only 15 years old. Lennon initially thought George was too young, but McCartney arranged a second audition where George impressed John with his guitar skills. That was the moment that set in motion the formation of the Beatles. But George was already stepping into a story that was dominated by Paul and John. The silent underdog, George's early role in the Beatles. From the very beginning of the Beatles, George Harrison was positioned as the silent contributor, always following the leadership of John Lennon and Paul McCartney. Lennon and McCartney wrote most of the songs, crafted the band's vision, and were the primary public faces. George, in contrast, was often sidelined. He contributed songs, but they were few, and his guitar arrangements were often second-guessed. Paul, in particular, had a dominating presence in the studio, and his perfectionism often overshadowed George's musical ideas. Harrison would later reflect, saying that Paul ruined him as a guitar player by subtly undermining his confidence over the years. Although George never spoke of this animosity openly, it was a source of constant internal conflict. George's growth as a songwriter. Frustrations begin to rise. By the time the Beatles were working on the White Album in 1968, George Harrison had become a more confident songwriter. He was no longer content with merely being a supporting player in the band. His frustration grew as he became more aware of his underappreciation in the studio. Paul, who had become the de facto leader of the Beatles, was obsessive about details, often stepping on George's creative contributions. These sessions for Let It Be in 1969 exposed the growing tension. One particularly telling moment occurred when Paul attempted to direct George's guitar part for the song Two of Us. George, exhausted by Paul's overbearing presence, calmly responded, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all." It wasn't a joke. It was the sound of a man reaching his breaking point, legal battles and lingering frustrations. In 1973, George Harrison released Sue Me, Sue You Blues, a song addressing the legal battles that ensued after the Beatles' breakup. While the song was aimed at the legal system, it was clear that much of George's frustration was directed at Paul, who had initiated the lawsuit to dissolve the band's business partnership. This legal dispute was a final blow to their already fractured relationship. In interviews, George's ex-wife, Pattie Boyd, revealed that George had always disliked Paul's personality. She recalled how George would come home from recording sessions filled with anger, frustrated by constant arguments with Paul. The tension between the two had become so intense that their friendship was reduced to mere tolerance. George's strained relationship with John Lennon, while George Harrison's issues with Paul McCartney were more visible, his relationship with John Lennon was even more complex and in some ways more painful. In the early days of the Beatles, George looked up to John as a mentor. John was older, witty, and fearless, qualities that George admired. However, as the years went on, Lennon became more absorbed in his personal life and his relationship with Yoko Ono. George felt emotionally abandoned, and Lennon's dismissive attitude toward his interest in Indian spirituality and meditation only deepened the rift. The lack of support and understanding from John hurt George deeply. In his 1980 memoir, I, Me, Mine, George hardly mentioned John at all, a deliberate choice that spoke volumes about their estranged relationship. Lennon's death, a complex grief for George. The emotional distance between George and John Lennon became even more apparent after Lennon's tragic death in 1980. Although George was deeply shocked, his tribute to Lennon wasn't full of nostalgia or sentimentality. Instead, he expressed his grief through music, writing songs that acknowledged the bond they shared, but also the pain that had come with it. In later years, George spoke more kindly of John, but the emotional scars from their time together were never fully healed. Harrison's complicated feelings toward Lennon were evident in his music and his reflections. The deep sense of betrayal and loss that he felt toward his former mentor lingered long after Lennon's death. The final years, quiet reflection, and unresolved tensions. As the 1990s progressed, George Harrison had largely distanced himself from the public eye. His solo career had flourished, and he had become a respected figure in both music and spirituality. However, the emotional residue from his years in the Beatles remained, especially when it came to his relationship with Paul. In a 1994 interview, when asked if he missed being in the Beatles, George responded, "Not with the others, no." The remark, though delivered with humor, was a sharp reminder of the unresolved tensions between him and his former bandmates. Even during the Beatles anthology project in the 1990s, old dynamics resurfaced, and George struggled under Paul's dominating presence in the studio. George's final moments, a quiet peace. In 1997, George was diagnosed with throat cancer, and his health quickly deteriorated. Despite his illness, George remained spiritually at peace, spending his final days with his family at their home in Friar Park. In a 2001 online chat, when asked about Paul, George responded with a witty Victorian proverb, "Scan not a friend with a microscopic glass. You know his faults, then let his foibles pass." This response, though delivered with elegance, was unmistakably pointed. It was George's way of acknowledging the complexities of his relationship with Paul while maintaining his characteristic sense of humor. In the final years of his life, George's relationship with Paul had softened somewhat. Paul visited George during his illness, and the two shared a quiet, personal moment. However, even in their reconciliation, the underlying tension between them was still palpable. George Harrison died on November 29, 2001, leaving behind a legacy of music, spirituality, and quiet rebellion. His relationships with John and Paul, though filled with moments of love and admiration, were also marked by deep, unresolved pain. Even in death, George's silence spoke volumes.